Hello, Internet, and welcome to the Gates Notes Book Club YouTube channel. This is a book club where we review books as suggested by Bill Gates and his blog, the Gates Notes blog. The first book that I've chosen is a book called These Truths by Jill Lepore, and this is the chapter one notes that I took from that book, and that chapter one is called The Nature of the Past, which covers the year 1492 to 1799. In short, I'm doing this book club in an effort to broaden my knowledge in a wide array of topics. The first topic being United States history of the United States. And so these are my notes and my opinions on chapter one of this book. I'm going to switch over to no longer seeing my face and just seeing the PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and view the PowerPoint. And let's take my face off of the screen and you'll just hear my voice. And so I read this first chapter actually a couple of times. The first time I read the chapter, and then I took notes on it the second time, and then the third time is when I transferred this into a PowerPoint. Since I'm a teacher, I tend to default to PowerPoint. There might be a better method of delivering this information. And so, you think about the history of the United States. We all learned early on Christopher Columbus, you know, 1492 sailed the ocean blue. And that's about the extent of what I remembered about Christopher Columbus. And I think there were three ships, if I'm remembering right, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, if off the top of my head. But there's a little bit more to Christopher Columbus, and I learned quite a bit about Christopher Columbus. He was originally from Italy. He was a citizen in Italy. Before he sailed to discover the New World, he was a sailor on a Portuguese slave trading ship, and so that's kind of who he was in I think in his early life, maybe 20s, maybe early part of 30s. Was he was sailing down to Africa to buy and buy buy slaves, and so by today's standards, certainly not an ethical person for that reason. Back then, that might have been more normal, but kind of a jerk if you ask me for that reason. It's today's standards, of course, a little bit different back then. Um, the reason why Columbus wanted to go west wasn't to discover new lands. They didn't know about these new lands, the new world, the Americas. What they were looking for was another way to get to Asia. Um, so, you know, they weren't looking to discover anything. I found it interesting that Columbus didn't sail for England. He sailed for Spain, and maybe I learned that at one point. Certainly didn't know that. Um, the reason why that's relevant, of course, when we fought for our independence, we fought against England. We did not fight against Spain. And so what Columbus did was he discovered the New World, but as we'll see in some notes here, um, let me try not to jump ahead of myself. So again, we won our independence in 1776. So why does, when we fought against England, so why does it start in 1492? And I guess the answer to that I understand, is that this was the first time the New World was discovered. Um, you know, in Spain and Columbus sort of did that discovery. Another thing that was really important is that Columbus was really the first to write it down. I don't know, you know, that's part of the frustration of history that the author kind of points out, is that maybe the New World was discovered. Obviously, there were people there, Indian tribes, and they weren't as civilized in the West as they were in England and Spain and things like that. Um, point being is that Columbus wrote it down, and so writing was a big deal as far as why this is documented in history as a real the first relevant time that someone went and discovered the New World, and then they wrote it down, and so um, that's extremely relevant. And then they also go on to say, well, there was also the printing press got involved. So, Columbus kept a diary, and the diary kind of got lost, and then found, and then rewritten, and journaled, and cataloged. But ultimately, it was the printing press that kind of um, was able to print that this new world had been discovered. Um, Another reason that it is important to the history of the discovery of the United States and America is that ultimately, we got our independence, and after that, a historian was kind of writing about why it was um, God's decision, if you will, that people in the new in the 13 colonies expand west and take all the lands west of the 13 colonies, what they called manifest destiny. And it helped the story that if you date back, 300 years, that these people have been here, going back to 1492. Therefore, these people have been, you know, uh, starting to take over the lands, and that's what God wanted them to do. Because they've been here for so long, clearly it's God's will that they take and own the lands. And so it helped the story for Manifest Destiny, which I found that very interesting. Um, Again, kind of going back to Columbus, he was kind of a jerk because he was a slave trader. I also thought it was a little bit of a failure story because he wanted to get underneath Asia, but instead he landed in Haiti, and Haiti's underneath Florida. So of course that's a little bit of a failure in the sense that he wasn't where he thought he was. In fact, he thought he was in the East Indies, which is south of Asia. In reality, he was south of Florida. He called the locals Indians because he thought he was in the East Indies. Something else that I learned and found interesting. There were people, the Indians, that were already there again. They weren't as civilized. Um, the Taino Indians. And I said they had a god, and what's interesting about that is kind of coming up why I put that note on. They did have religion. And then basically Columbus said, hey, Spain is the rightful owner of Haiti. And he wrote that down in his diary. Again, just because you write it down doesn't make it true, but it makes it more true because if you can't write anything down, um, then you have no way of contradicting that. And so he basically said, hey, this goes to this land is owned by Spain, and wrote it down, and it's kind of hard to um, you know to fight that if you can't write. He also said that the Indians had no government or God and were savages who could not rightfully own anything, and that was why he said that we can give this land to Spain. Of course, that was false. They did have a god, as I mentioned before. Um, so Columbus was a little bit of a jerk, um, and a little bit of a failure because he didn't ultimately achieve what he was looking to achieve, and a little bit of a liar because he said they didn't have religion when they did have religion. So my takeaway on Columbus wasn't positive. He was a jerk. He was a liar. Um, and he was a little bit of a failure because he did not achieve his goal, which was to find a way west to Asia. And so, you know, again, these are my notes, and so that's kind of at the end of every slide. What I'll do is kind of give my takeaway. And so my takeaway on Columbus: jerk, liar, failure, and you know, not exactly positive, but that's okay. It's my impression. The next thing that I took away, and again, this chapter was about 30 pages, and I think this was just like a couple of paragraphs. They introduce Aristotle, and I really don't know anything about Aristotle, so it's kind of interesting to find out a little bit about Aristotle. And they talk about Aristotle's politics, and I kind of need to, Google that and see what exactly Aristotle politics are, but they wrote down parts of Aristotle's politics, and so these were the notes I took, which Aristotle's politics says, and I read through this, that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjugation, others for rule. And so that's the theory behind slavery, in that some people are born from the hour of their birth, they are marked for subjugation. They are marked to be slaves, and others from their birth are marked to rule those slaves. And so Aristotle's a common name. Don't know much about it other than certainly have heard of Aristotle. And the first thing that I learned about Aristotle is that um, his belief system was used as justification for slaves. And so I wasn't a big fan of that. Um, Obviously, sitting here in 2020, slavery um, is today obviously no longer accepted. Whatever, that's the obvious thing to say. It's the obvious thing that's correct. All relations. Uh, all relations are relations of hierarchy. The soul rules over the body, men over animals, males over females, and masters over slaves. According to Aristotle, slavery was not a matter of law, but a matter of nature. And the King of Spain used this logic to declare the Native Americans were slaves by nature, and since they had no government, they did not own land, and since they had no God, they had no religion. That's the part I left off of there. This gave Spain the green light to conquer the people and their lands. And so, what Spain's was going to do is they're going to start taking and conquering the lands and enslaving their people, which is I think there was a little bit, if you look at the book, there was a little bit of back and forth on whether this was a good idea, because slavery is, why should one man rule over another? But the King of Spain used Aristotle's politics to justify why they could enslave Native American Indians and Africans from Africa, which led to the Spanish conquistadors. And so, Columbus comes over, discovers this island, says this island belongs to Spain. The King of Spain said, hey, these people are, um, savages, because they don't have government and they don't have God, of which the religion part was false, because it all came back as a lie from Columbus. But that's the logic that the King of Spain used to conquer the lands. And then the book goes on to talk about the actual conquering of the Spanish conquistadors and the conquering they did in North America. And so the conquistadors, basically their first army, if you will, came over in 1513, so 1492, 1513, 20 years later. Um, One of the major factors that the conquistadors used to conquer, because there weren't many of them, there were a lot more Indians, is they had immunities to disease. And here we are in 2020 talking about disease and coronavirus, and you know, it's eye-opening to me to just take a list, take a look at this list, look at all this disease that we have overcome over time, through, yeah, building up immunities, but also, of course, vaccines. And so that's another thing. Of course, Bill Gates is big into his vaccine research, and there's a lot of controversy around that. But look at all this disease we've overcome as a society over time. Back then, these diseases killed millions of Indian Americans, and so, um, or I should say, uh, native Indians um, to America. Anyways, uh, lots of plagues, so that helped the Spanish conquistadors kind of conquer. What they would do is the Spanish conquistadors, they'd conquer a piece of land. They would then the Native Americans would basically be forced to flee their lands because they were being killed, so they'd have to run away. They'd run until they felt safe, and then spreading the disease, and so that disease would then infect, the people around the next areas over geographically, and so some of the other things they make mention of, the conquistadors had guns, the Indians had bows and arrows. Um, then once they would conquer a piece of land, they would then loot the land with forced slavery. What I mean by loot the land is they'd take out whatever natural resources were there. Oftentimes, gold, silver were the big ones, and so they would use slavery, be it the slaves that were captured when they were conquering the lands, or slaves from Africa. And then they would move to the next chunk of land, conquer, and continue to send the Native Americans running and spreading disease. And so, what way I picture it is the disease started to spread, before the conquistadors would get to that area. And so, by the time the disease would, spread to the next, I think of it as like the next town over, the people were already weakened, they were already sick by the disease, and then in come the conquistadors with their guns, and they're, fighting people with bows and arrows. They didn't stand a chance. They were already sick, tired, and if you're sick, you can't fight to fight for your land. And so that's how Spain conquered a lot of, well, as this bullet says, conquered Mexico, so all of Mexico and more than half of the continental United States. And what I think it was more or less the southern half and a little bit more than the southern half. And so I think it did spread east to west in the southern parts of the continental United States. So I'm not confident of that, but the from the note I took, more than half of the continental United States, Spain was able to take over. And so that's how the beginning was of the civilized world discovering the New World, which was America and North America. And um, the book goes on to talk about, well, the English were late to the New World. Spain was in 1492, and that was Columbus, and then a little less than 100 years later, the Spanish were in Florida and New Mexico. The French came over in 1534, and then they were up in Canada by 1608. And so Queen Elizabeth gave the rights. Queen Elizabeth from England gave the rights to some land in North America in 1584. And so, well, almost 100 years behind the Spanish and about 50 years behind the French. Uh, Queen Elizabeth, the book goes on to say that she wasn't really too interested in the New World. But she did go ahead and say, okay, why don't this Walter Raleigh guy, why don't you go ahead and uh, go over there and start. I don't even know if they wanted to call it a colony. As it turns out, Raleigh went west and he landed on the Outer Banks, North Carolina. A lot of people know where that is. There's a couple TV shows that my wife and I watch on um, tuna fishing, oddly enough, in the Outer Banks. Anyways, he left 104 men basically to settle in the Outer Banks. They didn't last though, and so they they basically started to starve um, over their first winter, and they went back to England. And so, you know, England went west. They lasted for a winter, then they went back to England. So the first attempt was a big fail. The second attempt was a few years later by John White. John White settled in Roanoke. He was there for about a year. He went back to England and was looking for some supplies um, to help the settlement. And then when he got back to Roanoke, basically there was no one there. And so there was a note that he found that said they went inland to find a better site to settle, but everyone that was there was never heard from again. So the first couple of attempts for England to settle in the New World were failures. But they did have a taste of the New World, and they described it as paradise. And so there was a taste, and they wanted more. And so that was my big takeaway on my fourth note, was that the first couple of attempts were failures, but they wanted more. Note number 5, counting and measuring. I made this note number 5, even though these statistics kind of came earlier on in the chapter. This was kind of the jaw-dropping moment. This was the big, like, this would be the premier note if I had one note that I wanted to take. Um, and these were all the numbers between 1500 and 1800. Now remember, you know, in the timeline of this story, we're not even really too much out of the 1600s. So we've covered about 100 years. So this is actually going into the future a little bit. But between 15 and 1800, 2.5 million Europeans moved to the Americas. And so, that's an important number for the context of what's about to come. 2.5 million Europeans. They brought 12 million Africans there by force. And so they brought 5 times, roughly, um, slaves than people that moved there themselves. So 2.5 million Europeans, 12 million Africans. So when I read that, I thought, how can, like, as an individual, as one person, being able to enslave 5 people, how could I mean, I understand they had chains, they had, beaten morale down, um, but that's just crazy and nuts to think that, for every one person that came over, 5 to 6 slaves came over, and how they really must have had a system in place for mass control over these people. And it's just kind of hard for me to envision that as an individual, there's no way that I could control 5 to 6 people, even if I had chains and everything else. Just uh, again, not that I would ever whatever think of that, but that's just where my mind went. And then again, that 2.5 million Europeans wound up through the diseases that they carried and the conquering that they did, killed nearly as many as 50 million Native Americans. So 2.5 million people with their diseases killed 50 million, mainly of disease. Coronavirus is a big topic right now. Coronavirus has killed in the United States, as of November 21st, when I'm recording this, in the neighborhood of 200 and maybe 50 or 270,000 people. Okay, the disease that was back then killed 50 million people. And granted, this was disease and conquering, but primarily disease, killed 50 million Native Americans. I don't even know how many people are in America, North America right now. But 50 million, that's an incredibly large number. And, my takeaway with these numbers alone is I just can't believe how grim and dark this is. That they enslaved so many more people than there were of them. And then they killed even that many more millions. So, I mean, whatever, 2.5 million, just call it 2 million Europeans, round down there. 25 times for every one person that came over, 20 to 25 people died. For every one person that came over, 20 to 25 people died. And that's dark. That's dark. And so, as an individual, you kind of hear, oh, Thanksgiving, what are we thankful for? And you hear, but then you hear, Thanksgiving is a when we celebrate our founding, going back to these times, as if these times were a good thing. But then you hear, well, actually, these times were actually quite dark, and maybe celebrating Thanksgiving, is kind of messed up. This is really timely because we got Thanksgiving next week, and it really is dark. Really is dark. The founding of this new world. And that's my takeaway. Oh, by the way, those same Europeans that came over with all the slaves and killed all the people, they also looted all the valuable things and sent it back to Europe. And so I think about this and it's like, Europe, you owe us some money. I know that's a silly way, but look, you looted all of our lands and you carried all this gold and silver from America back to Europe, and that helped, as the book goes into, that helped Europe thrive, their economy thrive for hundreds or thousands of years. Well, I guess it can't be thousands of years because this is 1600. We're in 2020, so hundreds of years. I feel I say that jokingly, Europe owes us money, but really, you came over, you took what was in our land, and you sent it back to Europe. And so you should send me a gold brick. Okay, that's the end of my first. Like I enjoyed this uh, drastically. Um, these are my personal notes. I learned quite a bit from reading this chapter several times and taking notes. So I'm going to keep doing this. Again, my goal for this is to learn. Uh, Maybe through my notes, other people will find them enjoyable and can learn from me. That'd be great. Ultimately, this is a book club, so the point is to discuss the books. And so here's my last slide about let's discuss this first chapter, the nature of the past. And so the first question I have is, have you joined the book club? And so this is the first video I'm doing on my notes. And so what I'm looking for in this first book review, I'm looking for one person to join. Please consider joining the book club. The way to join is to register with the Google form that will be linked in the notes below, in the discussion below. So look in the discussion on YouTube and click the link, follow the link to the Google form, fill it out. If I can get one person to join, I will have met my goal. What did I leave out of the chapter? And so read the book, read chapter one, and what did I leave out? Obviously, these are my notes. I'm making 5 notes per chapter. What was big that I left out that you would say, well, how in the world could you screw that up? This is a big deal. What notes did you take from the chapter? The whole reason this is based on notes is on the Gates Notes blog. Bill Gates recommends that for comprehension, you read, but you also take notes. And so, if you are following along, if you are reading and doing this, I would encourage you to take notes. What did you think of my notes? And so, did I make a mistake? Did you enjoy the way I framed some of the information? And how can I improve these videos going forward? This is my rough draft. I'm in my basement. I haven't even cleaned it. This is my laptop's webcam. I do have a nice microphone, but my setup is fairly impromptu. How can I improve this going forward? I would appreciate any advice. My video editing, I'm using a piece of software called OBS, and I'm just going one take with these right now. I'm not even at the point where I'm doing video editing, intros, or anything like that. I have some ideas, but how can I improve these videos? Thank you for following along. If you stuck with me for these 30 minutes, please like the video, share it with your friends. I have a cheesy sign off, and so I'm going to sign off here. And my cheesy sign off is read good books and be good people. All right, folks, have a good day.